All right. Good morning again. Excuse me. And thank you for joining us today. We're very glad to see such strong interest in this conversation. My name is Samantha Barthelemy. I see a lot of familiar faces and names in the audience. I'm a senior advisor with the National Network for Safe Communities. And on behalf of our team, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on the problem analysis, a central component of the approach that underpins the National Network for Safe Communities violence prevention strategies. I'll be helping guide the conversation today as we move through the framing, the presentation, and discussion. And before we begin, I would like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to all participants after the webinar. We have 1 hour together today, and the presentation should take approximately 45 minutes, which will leave us with approximately 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Please feel free to submit questions, comments that you may have in the chat at any point during today's conversation. And at the end, we will do our best to address as many as possible. With that, it's my pleasure to turn this over to our Executive Director, Sasha Cotton. Sasha, over to you.
Thanks, Samantha, and good morning, everybody. I am so excited to see such a great turnout for this webinar on such an important topic of problem analysis. At the National Network, we are really focused on data-driven approaches and strategies that are rooted in data, right? Really looking at what does the data tell us as far as what an intervention can and should be to address and reduce violence. And so we are excited to share a little bit about our process today. And I won't take long because I want to hand it over to Alexis to get us started, but did just want to share a few thoughts before we get started. I think that sometimes the term problem analysis requires some demystification. Sometimes it can sound like a very technical term, but really it is about looking at the data so that we understand what the issues and concerns are on the ground. And it's about asking the right people the right questions to get the best understanding of real-time information so that community, law enforcement, governmental partners, and agencies can understand what's happening in a community so that we can focus our resources, time, and energy on the right people and places to have an impact on violence and the drivers of violence in a community. I also think it's really important to talk about what problem analysis are not. Sometimes, particularly those of us who have been in the work for a while, think about the days of the 90s and early 2000s where gang lists and heavy enforcement actions were a big part of violence prevention. Problem analysis do not lead to a list of individuals that we are going to focus our attention on. It's not about gang lists or gang databases. So I think it's very important for us to ground ourselves in what we're actually looking at, which is a clear and pragmatic set of information around what is driving violence in a particular community or location. I also just want to raise the fact that problem analysis do allow us to focus, and that is really important, particularly in a time such as these, where we know that resources are very limited and our ability to identify who, what, and where is driving violence so that our strategies will actually have the most important impact and most realized impact of driving down violence are more important than ever with the limited resources that we're seeing across communities in America and beyond. So I thank you for your time and interest in the problem analysis, and we'll turn it over to Alexis. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Here's hoping to no technical difficulties. I am going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone is able to view that.
It is up, Alex.
Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Alexis Acevedo, and I'm a senior research advisor at the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College. So today, as Sasha laid out, we'll walk through what a problem analysis is. It is one of the core tools that we use when working with cities to understand and reduce serious violence. In many places, violence prevention strategies begin with a broad broad assumptions about what is driving violence, things like drugs, things like youth crime. And what we try to do with the problem analysis is take a step back and look at the problem through a structured and systematic way, right? So the goal is to move away from assumptions towards a clear and shared understanding of violence dynamics. So once jurisdictions understand those dynamics, they are in a much better place to employ strategies that are focused, coordinated, and effective. So here is what we're going to cover today. First, we'll go over what a problem analysis actually is, and we'll go through some definitions. Next, we'll discuss why they matter. Many cities have lots of data about crime, but that information doesn't necessarily get combined in a way that helps stakeholders understand kind of the broader dynamics behind violence. Then we'll talk through some of the methods and exercises used in problem analyses. After that, we'll talk about some of the innovations and recent developments, including the ways that problem analyses can be conducted to look at different forms of violence with partners, with law enforcement partners, but also with partners outside of law enforcement. Then finally, we'll discuss some of the key findings and lessons learned that have emerged across many jurisdictions. So after the presentation, we'll save time for questions and discussion. So we've introduced who we are, who the national network is. We partner with cities to implement proven strategies to reduce violence, to build trust, and to transform public safety in partnership with communities across the world. So let's begin with what is a problem analysis. And before we do that, I think we have to talk about narratives, right? When people talk about violence in cities, we often hear a set of familiar narratives, right? For example, people may say that violence is mostly random, that it's happening everywhere, or that it's primarily driven by young people and their behavior, or strictly related to drug markets, right? So while these narratives contain some elements of truth, they really oversimplify and misrepresent how violence actually unfolds, right? So in many jurisdictions, violence is neither random nor evenly distributed. Instead, it tends to occur within specific networks of individuals and groups, and often in the context of ongoing conflict, right? So the purpose of a problem analysis is to cut through those narratives and develop a shared understanding of what's happening for public safety stakeholders. So, what are we actually talking about when we say problem analyses? So, problem analysis are structured and systematic information gathering exercises designed to help stakeholders understand the nature of violence in their city, right? So the process involves asking a series of relatively simple but very fundamental and important questions. The key idea is that many pieces of information about violence already exist within agencies and communities, but they often remain fragmented across different institutions and experiences. So the problem analysis brings those pieces together to create a more coherent picture of violence dynamics. And one of the important features of a problem analysis is the emphasis on frontline knowledge, right? So frontline practitioners, whether they are investigators, whether they're probation officers, whether they're outreach or violence interrupters, or whether they're community leaders, they often have detailed knowledge about conflicts, about relationships, and about the individuals involved in violence, right? So, but this information is rarely captured in official data sources, right? That lived experience, that intimate knowledge of what is going on in a community is often not captured in official data sources, right? So therefore, the problem analysis produces what the problem analysis produces reflects both formal information, right? What is captured in formal systems, as well as the experience of those working, in those areas in the community where violence occurs, right? So before continuing our deep dive, let's define a couple of terms, right? One important concept in problem analysis is the idea of groups, right? Uh, in this context, groups refer to two or more individuals who are committing crimes together or are connected through shared conflicts or activities, right? Groups don't need to meet legal or statutory definitions of gangs, acknowledging the fact that any jurisdiction across the country can have their own legal or statutory definitions of what they consider gangs, right? Sometimes these groups they may not have formal names, they may not have formal symbols, and they may vary widely when it comes to organization, right? Many of the groups that we see are informal networks of individuals who are connected through friendships, through family relationships, through neighborhood ties, or through their ongoing disputes, right? We also use the term group member involved incidents or GMI incidents. These are incidents in which either a victim, the suspect, or both are members of known groups within a jurisdiction, right? What this allows us to do is to code for incidents that have confirmed group member involvement, for incidents where there is likely involvement, right? Such as, for example, a drive-by shooting that hits an unintended victim with no specific suspects, but the context around that incident leads us to believe that that is connected to groups and the ongoing violence within that jurisdiction, right? It also allows us to code for incidents where there is no group involvement, right? I think a clear example of those type of incidents would be, some intimate partner relationship where neither the victim or the suspect are involved in any groups. And then finally, it also allows us to label incidents where there is no definitive answer of group involvement, right? And we consider these incidents as unknown GMI, right? This may be, a victim might show up at the hospital and relate the story that they were shot at this street, and the victim themselves might not be part of any known groups, but we don't have suspect information, so we can't definitively say that this incident is does not involve groups or does involve groups, right? So I think that's a very representative example of the types of incidents that end up being classified as unknown group member involvement. So problem analyses typically, at least in our tradition, involve several different exercises designed to bring multiple types of information together. One of the most important is the group audit, which identifies active groups within a jurisdiction and gathers specific information about each group. Another key exercise is the incident review, where stakeholders review recent homicides and non-fatal shootings in detail to understand the circumstances surrounding each incident. Each of these exercises provides different lens or perspective on the problem that we're trying to understand. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail of each of these exercises. So with the group audit, the goal is to understand who is connected to whom and where the conflicts are, right? We understand that in any jurisdiction, there can be many different groups or gangs or networks, right? There can be hundreds of different networks, existing in larger cities, right? For example, during the group audit, the participants work together to identify the groups that are currently actively involved in violence in a city or jurisdiction, right? We want to focus the conversations on the groups that have been recently involved in, non-fatal shootings, in homicides, or other forms of serious violence. For each group, participants discuss things like the group's name, right? If they have one, sometimes groups don't really have names, or sometimes they change, periodically, right? They discuss the size of the groups, right? So how many individuals are part of this group, the age range of those individuals within that group, some of the key activities that they're involved in, acknowledging that, individuals can be part of several different activities, and the key individuals within each group. This focus on key individuals is important because it is often true that within any group or network, there are key individuals who drive and are actively involved in violence, right? So we want to make sure that that conversation is as focused as possible. And the participants also discuss geographic areas where groups tend to hang out or reside, as well as any alliances or conflicts with other groups in that jurisdiction. And so this exercise, often reveals that violence in the city is driven by a relatively small number of groups and conflicts rather than being evenly spread out across the population. So next, we're moving on to the incident review. Incident reviews involve taking a closer and deeper look at recent homicides and non-fatal shootings. Participants examine the circumstances of each incident and ask questions such as what happened, right? What's the story of the incident? Did the victim and suspect know each other, right? Were they, family, or, were they friends, or was this more of a random incident, right? Were they involved in any groups, right? Was the victim or the suspect involved in any groups, or is this incident somehow, does this incident somehow have a relation to group activity in the city or jurisdiction? And was the incident related to a retaliation or to an ongoing dispute, with different parties, right? This process helps stakeholders identify patterns that may not be visible when incidents are examined individually. And we'll just talk about an example here. A non-fatal shooting occurs outside a convenience store. Initially, it appears random, right? There is no suspect here. It's common in a lot of non-fatal shootings. The victim, it might be familiar to the participants for other incidents, but they may not be explicitly familiar with that specific individual. So during the incident review, we might learn that the victim is associated with a group that had a conflict 2 weeks earlier, right? So this kind of additional information that, may be captured in the formal systems, but may not be captured in formal systems, really fundamentally changes our understanding of that incident, right? So an incident that we could have once considered a random shooting, not involving any group dynamic, suddenly turns into an incident where, there is a deeper connection to groups and ongoing conflict within that jurisdiction, right? So this is an example of information that might emerge during the incident review that, did not exist previously, right? So really important, who participates in a problem analysis, right? Well, depending on the type of problem analysis, right, whether it's geared more toward law enforcement participation or more towards community, one of the most important aspects is who ends up participating in the process, right? So, although these analyses have historically been conducted primarily with law enforcement, we know that there are stakeholders outside of law enforcement that are knowledgeable and familiar with violence in the city, right? So, this list represents anyone who could participate in a problem analysis, depending on the type of problem analysis that we're conducting. And we'll go into more detail into that a little bit later. So first, law enforcement personnel play a critical role, right? This often includes patrol officers, detectives, or specialized investigative units. Um, Patrol officers have a deep understanding of neighborhood dynamics and recurring conflicts, while detectives may bring, other detailed information from investigations that can help, shed light on some of the aspects of the incident, right? We also frequently involve probation and parole officers who supervise individuals returning to the community, because they have ongoing contact with those individuals who may be at higher risk of violence. They often have insight into some of those peer networks and some of those disputes and some of the tensions that might be developing, but not yet appear in official records. Another important partner is as prosecutors, right? This includes staff from like local district attorneys, officers. Prosecutors have often a broader view of cases that move through the court system, and they also might be really familiar with some of the individuals involved in violence, right, or in the groups as they appear across their cases, right? Their perspective can help clarify relationships between incidents and some of the individuals involved in violence. Researchers and analysts play a key role in the process, right? The problem analysis involves a lot of like reorganizing of administrative data, and analysts within whether it's the police department or other agencies in that jurisdiction, they play a key role in getting that information together. So their responsibility is usually helping to organize information, identify patterns across incidents and document findings so that they can be used to guide strategy and decision making as, the interventions unfold. In many jurisdictions, we understand that the street outreach workers and violence interrupters play a key role in community violence intervention programs. These individuals often have trusted relationships with people in the community where violence tends to concentrate, and they have knowledge about disputes and retaliatory dynamics that aren't captured in official data sources, right? So they are one of those key parties in the communities that know usually what's going on, right? We also try to include, when appropriate, community-based partners, right, who bring a different perspective, an outside perspective about local dynamics, and who center lived experience and their
I'm
knowledge about
sorry.
communities in this process. And finally, state and federal partners, such as federal investigators, task force members, or representatives from state agencies also participate, when their information or resources are relevant to understanding the problem. So what makes part of what makes this process important and powerful is that each participant, depending on the type of problem analysis, they bring a different piece of the puzzle together. So, no single agency has the full picture. But when we're able to bring these different perspectives together, we're able to develop a much clearer and more complete picture and understanding of the dynamics that are driving violence. So we're gonna next shift to talking about why problem analyses matter, and we're gonna make the case for a problem analysis, right? Maybe some folks are skeptical. Maybe, people believe that this information already exists somewhere. So we'll try to talk through some of those points, right? So one of the main reasons we conduct problem analyses is that even when jurisdictions have large amounts of data about violence, those data sources often do not combine to produce a clear picture of how violence actually operates and unfolds in a city. Uh, most cities collect a lot of information about crime, but that information is typically stored across different, systems and different agencies. And because of that, it's difficult to combine that information to see how incidents and individuals and conflicts are connected to one another. For example, homicide investigations usually focus on solving individual cases, right? So detectives and investigators are, understandably focused on identifying the suspect and kind of building a case for prosecution. And we understand that this work is essential, but it also means that some patterns that are important to violent prevention might be missed within those homicide investigations. At the same time, non-fatal shootings, occur more often and therefore frequently receive less sustained attention, right? So even though they often involve the same individuals and networks responsible for homicides, in many cities, non-fatal shootings occur at a much higher rate than homicides, so they can provide important clues and information about the relationships and conflicts that are driving violence. Another challenge is that, formal gang definitions can sometimes obscure the real dynamics of violence, right? Legal or statutory definitions of gangs tend to be rigid, and they may exclude individuals who are clearly involved in violent networks but do not necessarily meet the technical criteria for being, designated as a gang member, right? So as a result, important relationships between individuals or groups may go unnoticed, right? That is why we use the term groups, right? A good example of that is, a set of juveniles who are robbing individuals and, that escalates to a shooting. That network might not be seen as a formal gang, but it is a fact that they're involved in activity that led to serious violence, right? So that would be considered a group under our definition where it might not meet, that the level of, formal gang definitions depending on jurisdictions and cities across the country, right? And finally, some of the most valuable information about violence exists outside of formal databases altogether, right? So this frontline practitioner knowledge, either from from patrol officers, from probation officers, from outreach workers, from violence interrupters, or even from community members, they often have critical insight about conflicts and relationships and understanding some of this tension that exists in the community. And none of that is really captured in official records, right? So problem analysis helps bring these different sources of information together. And by combining administrative data, incident reviews, and frontline knowledge, stakeholders can develop a much clearer understanding of the underlying dynamics driving violence in their jurisdiction. So at the end of the process, a problem analysis produces important outcomes, right? First, it creates a shared understanding of violence dynamics amongst stakeholders. It establishes familiarity with the groups and individuals most directly involved in violence. Third, it provides a current snapshot of the current situation that can inform intervention strategies. And in many jurisdictions, this is the first time that stakeholders have a collective and shared and detailed picture of the violence problem within their cities that they're trying to address. So, these findings have practical implications for how cities respond to violence. For example, problem analyses can help outreach workers identify individuals who may benefit from services or support. They can help law enforcement prioritize enforcement efforts toward individuals most responsible and involved in violence. And they can also help with the identification of credible messengers and moral voices, right? So by understanding who's involved in violence, we can do a better job of figuring out within those communities who, can actually be a credible voice, to be able to spread the messages of the intervention to those individuals. And they can also inform community messaging strategies right? By identifying networks and where communication efforts may be most impactful, right? This is particularly important in regards to interventions where messaging and where direct face-to-face communication is kind of like one of the mechanisms within those specific interventions. Um, Next, we'll talk about kind of this broader data-driven ecosystem. You know, we work with a lot of cities on focused deterrence, but I think it's important to emphasize that problem analyses should not, and I believe are not limited to any single intervention model or strategy. So while they often have been used to inform focused deterrence strategies, the insights generated through a problem analysis can support many different types of violence prevention and reduction efforts, right? So, for example, cities that are investing in community violence intervention programs can use these findings to help outreach workers identify, which individuals and groups are most central to current conflicts, right? Law enforcement agencies can use the analysis to prioritize investigative resources and prevention strategies. Service providers can use the findings to better understand whom the organization or event um, and problem analyses, they provide a shared foundation of knowledge that, multiple public safety stakeholders can use to coordinate their efforts, right? So even in jurisdictions that are not implementing a specific, NNSC strategy, the process of conducting a problem analysis can be really, really valuable and useful. For many cities, this may be the first time that stakeholders have developed a comprehensive and shared understanding of the violence dynamics that are driving violence in their jurisdiction. So once this understanding exists, I think cities are in a much stronger position to ask, the important strategic questions of like where should we focus our resources, which individuals are driving the violence and what kind of interventions might be most appropriate to address these violence issues, right? So in many ways, the problem analysis serves as a starting point for for the development of a strategy. It helps jurisdictions move from broad assumptions about violence to clear evidence that can guide how they choose to respond to violence within their jurisdiction. So we're gonna talk about some of the innovations. First, there's a variety of exercises within kind of the broader problem analysis label, right? Um, it's not limited to the group audit and the incident review. Some of these innovations include techniques such as social network analysis, which can help identify relationships between individuals involved in violence. Reviewing criminal histories is really important to become familiar with the individuals involved at both sides of a violent incident, right? Uh, this can also extend to a review of like broader administrative data, right? That can tell us a lot about historical patterns related to violence in a jurisdiction. Uh, Mapping techniques can also help, identify kind of geographic concentrations of incidents and, where homicides and non-fatal shooting tend to congregate within a jurisdiction. And together, these tools provide like a richer and more detailed understanding of violence within a jurisdiction. So one area where we've seen important innovation in recent years is kind of the development of community-led problem analysis, including analysis that are conducted without direct participation from law enforcement agencies. So traditionally, problem analysis have relied on police data and participation from law enforcement partners, because, they often have the data, right? Because, investigators have access to detailed information about the incidents and the individuals involved in violence. However, several communities have begun exploring ways to conduct meaningful analysis using community knowledge and non-law enforcement partners. In the In these cases, the analyses might be done with community violence intervention organizations. It could be done with outreach teams, with local nonprofits, and with researchers, including, public health practitioners, right? These groups often have, deep relationships with people in the community. They understand the local violence dynamics within their communities, and therefore they have information that, in some aspects might be equivalent to what law enforcement knows, right? So the goal in these situations is not to replicate the exact same analysis that would occur with law enforcement involvement, but it's to develop the best possible understanding of violence dynamics using knowledge and information that are available to community partners. So in some jurisdictions, these community involved efforts can serve as a starting point for, much broader collaboration, right? So once communities develop a clearer understanding of violence, that information can help open new conversations with other public safety agencies about how to coordinate responses and kind of like where roles are aligned and where roles are separate, right? So ultimately, even with community-led problem analyses, the key principles remain the same, right? Those closest to the problem often have the most valuable insight into the problems, right? So whether the analysis includes law enforcement partners or not, the process should prioritize knowledge and experiences of individuals and organizations, working directly with their communities affected by violence. So when community partners are involved in the analysis process, I think it's important to establish clear ground rules, right? Participants need to understand how information will be shared, how confidentiality will be protected, and how findings will be used, right? It's also important to ensure that the process respects, the lived experience of participants and prioritizes safety over information gathering, right? Acknowledging the fact that, folks who work in the community, might have different safety precautions, right? And also we have to ensure that we help maintain their trust and credibility with the people that they're working with, right? So there are couple more precautions, different set of precautions, right? Because precautions exist also with working with law enforcement and how that data is maintained and protected, right? So this working with the community brings a new set of things that we have to think about before we even start working with them to create a problem analysis. So while the problem analysis, were initially developed to understand group violence, the same principles can be applied to other forms of violence. So, for example, they can be used to analyze intimate partner violence, they can drug market conflicts, and violence in international contexts, right? The underlying approach remains the same, right? The focus on specific problems, gathering information from those closest to the problem, and answering fundamental questions about what is driving violence, right? And it can also involve, exploring other data sources outside of traditional, group violence problem analyses, right? So next, we're going to talk about some of the important findings that we have, found across time doing these problem analyses. So across many jurisdictions where problem analyses have been conducted, several patterns, appear consistently. And I think these findings help us, reinforce the value of the approach, right? So this figure illustrates one of the patterns that frequently emerges from problem analysis, right? And that is the relationship between different groups involved in violence, right? So each node here represents a group that has been identified through the group audit process. Groups, these can be formal gangs, they can be informal, looser sets of networks, right? And then the lines connecting each node represent the relationship between those groups, right? In this figure, red represents the conflicts, green represents the alliances. Um, these type of visualizations can reveal clusters of groups that are closely connected to one another, suggesting that violence may be, concentrated or maybe circulating within particular networks of information, of relationships. Understanding these relationships is important because it helps stakeholders identify where interventions might have, the greatest impact and, you know, who it might have the greatest impact on, right? Another very consistent finding is that violence is highly concentrated, right? So a relatively small number of individuals and groups are responsible for a significant share of serious violence in many jurisdictions, right? So in this figure, across at least five different problem analyses, we find that groups that represent less than 0.5% of a jurisdiction's population are involved in at least 41% of homicides and non-fatal shootings, right? So this particular finding is what makes focused interventions possible, right? If violence were evenly distributed across the population, targeted strategies would be much less effective. The problem analysis also reveals important demographic patterns among individuals at highest risk of involvement of violence. These patterns can help, inform prevention and intervention efforts. However, it's important to approach these findings carefully and avoid like stigmatizing communities or groups, right? This figure in particular shows that across 45 sites, individuals involved in group violence had an average age of 25 compared to 34 for those individuals involved in non-group violence. The ages of individuals involved in group violence tends to concentrate heavily between 18 to 24, with an additional sizable portion falling between 25 to 34, right? This figure also shows us that the majority of individuals involved in group violence across 49 sites are male. This is both true for non-group violence as it is true for group violence. And lastly, across 44 sites, Black individuals comprise the higher percentage of those involved in GMI incidents compared to non-GMI incidents, right? So this tells us kind of the disproportionate impact of group violence in Black communities across the country, right? And this is also very site specific, right? So these are patterns that we've seen, broadly across a set of sites, but each city, has its own dynamics, right? So this is some of what the problem analysis helps us understand. And then another important finding is that different forms of violence tend to overlap with one another. For example, group members may be involved in incidents of intimate partner violence. So, for example, IPV related incidents account for 5% of group member involved incidents. In some jurisdictions, a significant proportion of IPV related incidents involve individuals who are connected to group violence networks, right? Across 42 sites, group members are involved in at least 1 in 4 IPV related incidents. That to me tells me that community violence, group intimate partner violence is something that we should pay particular attention to, right? And across 43 sites, an average of 32% of group member involved incidents involved at least one juvenile individual, either as a victim or suspect, right? So this highlights the important involvement of youth in group violence, right? So recognizing these overlaps can help jurisdictions develop more integrated responses to violence. Going to skip ahead because we're running a little low on time. I'm going to focus on what I think are the most important parts here. Some of the common challenges that we run into or that we understand exist when, conducting a problem analysis is, either incomplete or missing data, right? So even though you know, we do our best attempt to bring together different sources of data, there will still be information that is missing, as there are incidents where there just isn't a lot of information known, right? Another challenge is agency silos, right? So different agencies often collect information, but that information is frequently stored in separate systems, right? So part of the problem analysis or part of the work of problem analysis is breaking down silos, right? Information silos. Um, there's often reluctance to share intelligence or sensitive information, and that is why we do a lot of pre-planning, and we go through the necessary steps to ensure that the information that is being shared is kept is protected, and that the participants there feel encouraged to participate in that process. Despite these challenges, many jurisdictions find that the process of working through them can actually strengthen collaboration across partners and lead to a much more complete and shared understanding of violence dynamics. So I'm going to continue to this one, and I think I'll pause here. Um, So over time, several lessons have emerged from jurisdictions that have conducted problem analysis, right? One key lesson is that while places matter, people often drive the violence, the dynamics of violence. Another lesson is that violence often clusters around triggering events such as retaliatory incidents. And finally, insights from individuals outside of law enforcement, such as community members and outreach workers, can be invaluable, right? And maintaining ongoing analysis is also essential since violence dynamics can change over time, right? So the problem analysis, from my perspective, represents the start of maintaining this ongoing analysis that can, inform a public safety strategy as it unfolds, right? So I'm going to pause here to save some time for questions. There were other slides, but we can share those slides when we share out the whole presentation.
Thank you, Alexis. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of the session. And thank you for posting comments and questions. First one we'll address, what are the distinctions, if any, for how we approach a problem-solving analysis for domestic violence versus community violence?
Yeah, I think that the type of information that you're looking at is gonna look different. The type of questions that you ask during the incident review is gonna look different, and the focus is gonna be different, right? For group violence problem analysis, we try to get a wide understanding of and really focus on the homicides and non-fatal shootings that those groups are involved in. Whereas for domestic violence, I think we want to look at kind of the people involved, the relationships, and what that relationship dynamic is involved there. And I think this other piece that can really assist us in understanding, the IPV or DV dynamics is looking at different administrative data, right? So calls for service, like maybe to places where law enforcement is being frequently called for a DV incident. It can look like the IPV DV related homicides and what was known to the lead up of those homicides, right? So it's a different approach, but I think that the fundamentals are still the same of asking basic questions of, gathering individuals and participants who know the people that were involved, who are familiar with the relationships involved, right? So there are some different steps that we take in order to prepare for, a IPVDV problem analysis.
And Alex, another question, if you would add anything on top of what you just shared with us, are there separate parameters for a GVI versus a community violence intervention problem analysis?
Yeah, I think that what's really different there is how you prepare for it. Um, you know, I I would say it's equally as challenging developing relationships with the law enforcement partners as it is with community partners, but maybe with community partners, it might be maybe a little bit more difficult, right? To establish that trust, to let them know clearly, what the process is and what the purpose of the process is. So I think that there's just a lot more involvement in terms of preparation when when it comes to a community led problem analysis, right? Essentially, you have to let them know that that information is for their purposes and belongs to them and is owned by them, right? So we're simply facilitating um, that those exercises, but that information lives with them. I think the same is true for law enforcement, right? So when we do these problem analysis with law enforcement partners, that information is ultimately shared back with them. Right?
Just chime in here. I think I would contextualize it, the question, I just want to frame it a little bit. That GVI, I wouldn't frame it as GVI versus CVI. I would frame it more as law enforcement versus community partners, because both of them could be used for any violence prevention strategy. It just depends on who we're asking the questions of. So neither one of them is a GVI or a CVI specific problem analysis. It's just the source of where the information is coming from that's different.
And maybe this next one could be so either Sasha or Alexis. So thinking if you had to explain the value of a problem analysis to a mayor and other elected officials in a sentence or two, what would you say?
I'm happy to give my initial answer, and then I encourage Alexis to chime in. One of the things that I've been saying to elected officials and community leaders on a regular basis lately is that violence is a manageable problem, but someone has to manage it. And it's the responsibility of local communities and local officials to develop strategies to manage that problem. And you can't manage a problem if you don't know what it is. And so problem analysis is designed to give us the information we need to understand who, what, where, when violence is happening so that we can develop strategies to address it. So the problem analysis is the basis of finding out what's going on to develop a data-driven answer and solution so that we can manage the problem of violence in a community. Alex, I don't know if you have anything you'd add to that.
I think the only thing I would add is that it can be part of conversations about resource allocation, right? So it can inform those conversations, but it's not meant to guide that, but it can be part of that conversation at least, I would say.
And we've absolutely seen that. The necessity to pivot. Sometimes cities think that they know what their violence problem is based on, police engagement or, what I always say is it's like, oh, the Cottons, they've always been a problem. So we got to focus on Sasha. But the data doesn't always bear that out to be true. And so we could be wasting our allocations focused on the Cotton clan when in fact it's really these other issues that are driving violence. And that might be a different group. It might be domestic violence. It, rarely, but is sometimes that we need to focus our energy more on young people than on what we're doing. So it really does help to give us a clearer picture of what we should be doing with resources, and that's time, energy, and financial resources. I would also just chime in that, sometimes it allows cities to stand, up ideas that are, without a data approach, we stand up strategies that are addressing the wrong problem. So, to simplify, it gives us the ability to address the right problem.
So Sasha, this might be a nice transition to a last question. If you can speak of an example where a strong problem analysis changed the direction of a city's violence reduction strategy.
Yeah, I think to what we were saying before, this empowers cities to know what their problem is and address them head on. What we see is that, and I won't go into the specifics of sharing any one particular site, but I think that what we bear out in problem analysis is helping people to understand where their problems exist And often recently, what we're seeing is that people are identifying that they have more domestic violence than they realized, and that there's sometimes this intersectionality between intimate partner violence and domestic violence with community violence that cities maybe anecdotally understood but couldn't identify through the data. And so that gets bared out and allows cities to really think about what kind of strategies they can stand up to address that intersection, as well as the individual problems of community violence and intimate partner violence. So while I'm not prepared to give a specific example of a site, the problem analysis is empowering cities to understand what drives their violence and to design and develop strategies, either in consultation with us or in consultation with their community or other TA providers that address the problems that are existing in real time versus assumptions.
Thank you. So that brings us to our end today. So thank you, Alexis and Sasha, and thank you everyone for joining us today and contributing with thoughtful comments and questions. As a reminder, the webinar was recorded and our team will share this recording with all participants at a later date. We hope to see you at a future NNSC event and wishing everyone a great rest of your day.